Aren't you scared?
Well, that's just fine.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little pingus too.
Hello everyone, and welcome to day 13 of Terrorthon, a brief history of witches. In previous years we've covered werewolves, zombies and vampires. It makes sense to do witches because they've got quite a rich history. So much in fact, I don't think I'll be able to cram it all into this video, but we'll certainly give it a shot, starting with witches in real life. So let's do that right away. So people have been practicing witchcraft using magic spells since the dawn of time, calling upon spirits to bring about change or otherwise help them. And early doctors using traditional healing methods, or just wise women, were often misunderstood with their profession and accused of being witches. The earliest reference to a witch we can find is of course in the Bible, in the book of Samuel, which tells the story of King Saul seeking the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help them defeat the Philistine army. The witch did revive Samuel, who then prophesied the death of King Saul and his sons. King Saul's sons died in battle the very next day, and so King Saul committed suicide. And of course, who could forget the famous passage in Exodus chapter 22 verse 18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." We've all heard that one, right? In the mid-1400s, the witch hunts began in Europe, with many witches confessing to being witches and then being hanged or burnt at the stake, and single women and widows were targeted especially. Between 1500 and 1600, around 80,000 suspected witches were put to death, and most of them were accused of being filled with lust and being in cahoots with the devil. In 1486, a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the Hammer of Witches, was published. It was used as a guide for flushing them out, and for over 100 years this book was the second best-selling book apart from the Bible, all around Europe. As the hysteria began to die down a bit in Europe, it increased in the New World, with the best-known witch trials taking place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. 150 people were accused of being witches, with 18 of them being put to death, and that includes 6 men, interestingly enough. In 1706, a woman known as Grace Sherwood was accused of being a witch, and it was decided that she would be thrown into a body of water with her arms and legs tied, and if she didn't sink, she was a witch. You've probably heard of this old trope. Here's where it gets interesting though. Although she did float, she wasn't put to death. She was imprisoned for 8 years. And then by about 1730, the idea of witchcraft was considered ridiculous, with people making parodies of it all the time. And that brings us all the way to the present day. We've got modern witches who are known as Wiccans, and they avoid evil at all costs. In fact, harm none is their motto. And they follow a book called the Book of Shadows, nothing to do with Blair Witch, which was written in the 1900s. And the thing is, modern witches are pretty much the same as most witches throughout history. They worked for good, not evil. However, get this, witch trials continue to this day in the likes of Papua New Guinea, where a mother was burned alive in 2010 because she was being accused of being a witch. So, even in the modern era, this nonsense still continues, unfortunately. But what about witches in fiction, and in particular on the big screen? Well, that's a very rich and detailed history as well, but we'll do our best. So the earliest silent movies featuring witches generally just retold the Salem witch trials. It wasn't until the Swedish film Häxan, released in 1922, that witches really came into their own on the big screen. This is a very interesting movie which blends a documentary format with horror, and I actually recommend it. It's quite interesting as a time capsule. But then after the suffrage movement, witch appearances sort of dwindled, but they did appear in animation frequently, but most famously probably being in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. And then, the most famous witch of all, the Wicked Witch of the West, appeared in The Wizard of Oz, released in 1939. Unfortunately, witches around this time were sort of rooted in anti-Semitic stereotypes, and that's all I'll say about that. And then in 1964 we got more family-friendly witches in the form of a sitcom, Bewitched. That came out in 1964. But then it didn't take long before witches began to become sinister and scary again in giallo movies, especially such as Suspiria, released in 1977, a strong recommendation. And then a movement began in the 1980s known as the Satanic Panic, which really merits its own video, maybe one other day. So there were no witch movies for a while, until the 90s when they came back in full force with the likes of The Witches of Eastwick, The Witches, Hocus Pocus in 1993. And then, teen witches were born with the likes of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Charmed in 1998, and to this day witch movies continue to be released. Sometimes they're sinister and evil, sometimes they're goofy and playful, but they're always there, with the likes of The Vampire Diaries, American Horror Story, and a personal favourite of mine, The Witch, directed by Robert Eggers. And that's it. As promised, a brief history of witches. There were so many areas that I didn't cover. It's a very, very meaty subject, and if you're interested, I highly recommend looking into it. Very interesting stuff. But for now, see you tomorrow.